This is another Pioneer CT-F950 three-head cassette deck manufactured in the late 1970s. I usually start these videos off with the faceplate removed so that I can go through and talk about some of the things that I had to do to get this deck resurrected. So I'm going to do that now. So as this is recording, I'll point out a few things. Right now it is recording onto a Chrome CR02 TDK-SAX90 with Dolby on. And in a few minutes when I put the faceplate back on, what you'll see is that what you're actually hearing is what's being recorded on the tape. The source is coming through here now, and that's actually what's being recorded on the tape. When you're using a top quality tape, they're virtually indistinguishable. Now let's talk about the CT-F950 and talk a little bit about what you get with a 950 over maybe, let's say, the CT-F900. The CT-F950 includes the ability to record onto a metal tape. Now, I know that metal tapes aren't being made anymore, at least I have not found any that are being made. You can still get them on eBay. They're running in the $20 a tape range. Certainly, it's something that you can, with this deck, use in terms of recording. You can record onto them, but you can record onto every other tape type that was ever released. And when I put the faceplate back on, I'll go through them. But all tape types, type 1, 2, 3, and 4, which is metal, you can record with this deck. Now, when I get these decks, they're always in terrible condition, sometimes all the way through the electronics, but definitely in terms of the mechanics and the drive itself. So I'll go off tripod in a minute and I'll take you on a tour inside the deck. But to begin with, one of the things that I do have to replace is the pinch rollers. Now this does have an aftermarket pinch roller here. It has a rebuilt pinch roller here. I rebuild those pinch rollers by using a service called Terry's Rollers. I'll give him a roller and that's in bad condition, and he will actually re-roll the rubber onto it for me. High quality, they always work, but they cost me $50 each time I do it. So they're very expensive. But on this side, this takes a special size and they're very hard to find. Other things that have to be done, of course, when you remove your pinch rollers and you retension them and you do work on them, you also have to replace this nut. Now the nut that comes with it or that was on it originally will strip usually when it's taken off. So I use a new nylon nut. And notice I paint it to keep it in place. Paint, you'll also see on these two posts, these govern your azimuth. And the azimuth has been now calibrated properly against a calibration tape that I use. And so all of these decks get recalibrated. Now, inside the mechanism, there are 3 belts that have to be dealt with. There are various components that have to actually get cleaned. And there's also, I don't know if you can see it or not, but this we call them tire. This tire here has to be replaced almost every time. These wear out, these get old and they stop gripping. This will stop gripping. Occasionally I have to replace one of the spindles. Usually I can clean these And I also have to take care, you'll notice this is kind of springy. Notice how springy it is. Well, there is a spring that fatigues over 40 years, and I usually have to strengthen that spring. That's good and strong, and that needs to be strong because this tire presses up against these two spindles to be able to turn them. And if it doesn't have sufficient force, or the tire doesn't have sufficient friction, you won't get take up. But if you look at this, this is pretty good take up, right? Okay. Now we're going to take a look on the inside. When we look at the inside, we're going to look at a few things that get that will get done on these decks whenever I am servicing them, and I'll talk about those as I go through to show you. Number one, I always rebuild the take-up motor. Now this is a housing that has a motor inside. I always take this apart and clean the armature. They're almost always very dirty. These run at two different speeds. They are the workhorse on this deck. You would think it would be the normal drive motor that runs the capstan. Not so. This gets a lot of work because that's moving the tape fast forward, backward, and it's also working tension. And you can see it operating in there. Yes, I do shine up or refit or clean the pulleys. You'll also notice the main drive belt, which is down here. There's a belt here, and then there's a belt there. I think I said that there are three belts. There's actually one, two. There's a belt here, and there's also a belt for the counter that I forgot to mention. So you actually have a total of 4 belts and that tire. Now, something else that, you know, whether you buy this from me or you buy it from somebody else, doesn't really matter. Make sure that they have replaced the capacitors on the power supply. This is the power supply. Now, it's true that the capacitors, you know, everywhere else in the deck probably should be replaced. But there's a difference between a capacitor that may affect sound to some degree and a capacitor that may affect an output voltage that could ruin that display. And I'm going to tell you right now, getting those displays is very, very hard. You can only get them when they've been, when a deck has been parted out. So you don't want this power supply all of a sudden pushing, instead of maybe 18 volts through here, 25 or 35 volts or AC into the FL control board. So, you know, buy mine, buy somebody else's, whatever you do, make sure they have replaced the capacitors. Now, I replace the capacitors with pretty good versions of capacitors that I get from Mauser. These are high quality capacitors. They're at spec or over spec. And when I say at spec or over spec, if this capacitor, let's say it's a 50 volt, I don't know off the top of my head. Let's say it's a 50 volt. I may replace it with a 50 or a higher voltage. That's just to make sure that any spike in voltage doesn't negatively affect the capacitor. It's my prerogative. Sometimes I do it, sometimes I don't. It depends on what I'm able to find. These capacitors need to be replaced, all of them on this board. If you don't, then what could happen, and has happened, is I've had this capacitor go out on a board, which has taken out this transistor and this diode. And when that happens, it's bad. Now that you're aware of what to do with that, there's also the control board. Now the control board manages the logic, you know, fast forward, rewind, and all of that. You don't have to hit the stop button between choosing fast forward or rewind or play. You don't have to worry about when it gets to the end of the tape, that it will automatically stop because this capacitor here takes care of that for you. So that's one of the reasons that I replace all of the capacitors on the control board, because that one in particular almost always is out of spec. And I can tell because when it gets to end of tape, if it's struggling and not stopping, let's say it's at end of tape and I'm measuring 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 seconds and it finally shuts off, that's because it took 10 seconds to charge up an old capacitor that's no good anymore. It should take 3 seconds with a new one. Now, some other things. Before anybody gets really, really concerned, this resistor gets very, very hot. On one end, it might be, I don't know, 120 degrees. At the other end, it might be 277 degrees. Typically, it's between 120 and 250. So I have seen smoke come off of these. That's usually because it's burning off dust. So what I'll normally do is clean these, and when I first get one of these decks, I'll clean it. I'll measure the voltages, make sure that we don't have too much voltage going through. And of course, when I've cleaned up the board, I rarely have any issues with it. But be aware that is going to get very, very hot. It's supposed to. Now, as we take a tour on the rest of the parts on the inside, I'm focusing now on the motherboard. Now, the motherboard is where all of the main electronics for the audio input, output, and processing is done. These two riser boards are amplification boards, and all of these work in conjunction with one another based on the switching that you have selected. Now, what's also important is things that you do need to know. This particular slide switch, I always pull apart. This governs the Dolby selection. You'll get a lot of noise with this. So I always take this apart. It's easy. This actually slides out, and you just have to make sure that you don't lose the contacts that come out. This slides out, and then I clean the inside, and then I DeoxIT the inside. Typically, I'll do the same thing with these as well. Depends on if I have any kind of static that's coming through whenever the selections are made. Just depends. Now, on this particular unit, you'll notice a lot of red capacitors. Those are all audio grade capacitors that I've replaced on this board. I have recapped this board with new electrolytic capacitors. I didn't say that earlier when I was talking about the power supply. Electrolytic capacitors are what were replaced. I do not replace ceramic capacitors. I don't replace these polystyrene capacitors because they don't tend to go out of spec. Occasionally, I'll replace a transistor or a set of transistors. If I do one, I normally do the companion, so left and right. But for the most part, these units don't have issues with the transistors themselves. I will make minor changes to pots depending on settings that I have to make to bring it back into spec when I'm using the oscilloscope. I never make changes to these. I do take that Faraday cage off and replace the electrolytic capacitors in there. Occasionally I'll replace the transistors there as well if I'm having trouble with bias. I very rarely will recap the board that's behind the FL display. Very, very rarely. The only time that I do that is when I'm having a problem with the board itself. Those capacitors are fairly small anyway. They're usually 5 microfarad, 1 microfarad, very low voltage. Tend to not be out of spec very much, if at all, when I remove them. So when I have done them in the past, it's borne no fruit. So I don't do that unless I have to do something to the board. Now I also use DeoxIT on all of the volume pots, these pots, any switches that control sound, I'll use DeoxIT. Okay, now I've taken you on a tour of the outside of this. Or the inside of this. Now we're going to put the faceplate back on. We're going to take you through a tour of the features, and we're actually going to do some tests with some tapes so that you can hear what this sounds like. Now what we're going to do is go through some audio tests. And in those tests, we are going to record audio onto a Type 1. This is a UR60 from Maxell. We are going to then record onto a high bias tape. This is a Type 2 tape. Then we're going to go to a ferrochrome tape. Ferrochrome tapes are no longer in production. Sony stopped making them. Sony was the last to make them, and they stopped making them in 1985. But this does have a ferrochrome setting, so we'll test on that. And we'll also test on a metal tape. This happens to be a Maxell MX110 that we'll record on. So there's going to be a lot of recording and playing back here. What I will also do is when I publish this video, I'll also publish an MP3, and I will choose a tape type, and it'll be a Type 2 tape that I'll use so that you can go to the Google audio library, pull the same selection I have used to record and play back, and listen to it yourself to see if the fidelity that this unit produces, this particular unit produces, is in line with what you're looking for. This will be for sale on eBay by the time this video is released. I will look for all kinds of questions from anybody. You can post them here in YouTube, or you can post them in eBay. But I expect you to ask questions before you purchase it. And I mean, ask any question you want. These are, I refurbish these, I resurrect them, I bring them back from near death. In this particular scenario, I actually had to replace several of these buttons because the chrome had worn off. I always shine everything up. I polish everything after I've gotten the unit into tip-top mechanical and electronic shape. But this is 40 years old. Actually a little older. This was, in the late 1970s. It's entirely possible that you could get this home, get it delivered, and use it for 6 months, and then for some reason it stops. I cannot guarantee something that's 40 years old. But what I can guarantee is that when you get it, it won't be dead on arrival. It will work. It will work as you see it in these videos, and it will perform very nicely. Now, to that, let's go ahead and get to doing some testing with these tapes. I'm going to just simply start a recording going. Let me see if I've got any source coming through. Okay, I do. Let me stop that, and then I'm going to choose an arbitrary source. Right now, there is, I don't know what's on this tape, so I'm just going to make sure we're reset at 0. I'm going to start recording now. I'm going to make sure it's set to standard. I have my Dolby in. We'll talk about bias in just a minute. So at this point, I have no source coming in. I'm going to go ahead and start something. I'm going to be using different selections off of the audio library on YouTube. All right. The bias affects the recording on a particular tape based on characteristics of that tape. Here, if I turn it left, it might brighten it a little. If I turn it right, it may dull it a little. I find right in the middle tends to be about right. Now let's play this back. And when we do, I'm going to use an automatic function, which is to repeat once it gets to 0. Now what I've done, this will get to 0, and it'll start. And when it starts, it is starting at counterpoint 0 or very close to it because of an automatic setting here using the counter repeat. Now this will start the selection that we were listening to earlier, and then we'll listen to it. And it will probably use Smokey's Lounge for the rest of this instead of the Espers on the Beach, which that's World Sunrise, which this was. You can tape Dolby out. You can hear the effect Dolby had by boosting the highs. Next up, we will do a recording on a Type 2. In between now and then, I do want to point out that the output volume, you'll notice not only does it affect the output, but it also affects the FL display. When you're recording and you're on tape, it'll do the same thing, but it can fool you. So it can fool you in the sense of if you think you've got this, if you have this down really low, you may think you have to have your input on record very high. You need to read the manual, and you'll get a copy of the manual with this. The way to use this is to keep your output high if you're going to be monitoring tape when you're adjusting your input. Now, we're going to go to the next tape type. The next tape type we're going to use is a Type 2, which is CrO2, chromium dioxide, high bias tape. Now these tapes are the most popular that Type 1 and Type 2 are the most popular you're going to find on the internet. You can still get Type 1 tapes. You may be able to buy new Type 2 tapes. The main producers, which were TDK and Maxell, have long stopped production of them, but there are third parties like ATR and others. So you can get them. What I'm going to show you now is the same sort of recording that we did before. I'm going to choose to use that second selection, which is Smokey's Lounge. And then we'll go ahead and play that so we can hear how that sounds. Now notice, I'm going to keep everything the same. I'm going to keep my bias, my Dolby in. I may have to adjust this input depending on how it's recording. So we're going to give that a shot. I'm going to get started now. And I'm going to go ahead and re-zero that counter and start now. Now, what you're hearing is what's actually being recorded on the tape. That's what's coming in through the source. That's actually being recorded on the tape. Virtually virtually the same. Now we'll listen to that. Actually, let me work the bias first. That really brightens it up or dulls it down in the middle. Now let's listen to that. No Dolby, Dolby in. If you hear it going higher, the high is going higher and lower, that was the bias. So the next tape we're going to try is a ferrochrome tape. Here's a ferrochrome tape, FeCR. Switch this to FeCR. You don't have an indicator that shows you that it's that is a ferrochrome tape, but what you do have is a setting here that you can see. Now, ferrochrome tapes tend to be warmer sounding. They tend to have a little less tape hiss. So when you think about, when you're looking at the different tape types, type 1 tends to have very, very high tape hiss, low what we call signal to noise ratio. Type 2s have better, lower hiss on those tapes. Type 3s have even lower and a little bit lower, more like chrome. And then metal tapes have the lowest tape hiss. Now, when we record on a ferrochrome tape, as I said, you may hear it sound a little more warm. So we'll get our recording started. Make sure everything is stopped. Okay. Get our recording started. Make sure we re-zero. And there we go. Remember what I told you about this. It's like nothing's being recorded, but something's being recorded because I've got source now. And that's the true view for this setting. When you put it on monitor, tape monitor, then you have control over the output here. This is not affecting what's recorded on the tape. This is affecting what you're hearing. This affects what's recorded on the tape. But because it's a 3-head deck, when you press tape, that third head is actually reading what has just been recorded. So let's listen to this. We'll adjust the bias. Wow. I notice I went left on my bias and it got sort of lower and a little duller. Let's see what happens when we go right. A little more in the middle, but if I bring it right to 0, it seems to be the best. Now let's listen to this. Remember, I've got my counter set, so when it rewinds, it's going to start at 0. It's going to play back. Doesn't sound as bright, does it? It's a much warmer sounding tape format. Okay. Now toward the end of this, there we go, we messed with the bias. You can really hear the bass. So again, very warm. You didn't lose all your highs, they're there, but very warm equalization with this tape type. Okay, so now we're going to try metal tape. So now we have a metal tape. This is an MX110. These tapes are still available. You can get them used and new on eBay. Used might run you about 10 bucks a tape. New is about 20. And when I say new, it's new old stock. These are not being made anymore. I don't recommend buying them because the Type 2s, which are chrome, actually sound perfectly fine. But for the purist out there, you know, metal is it. That's the highest you could ever go. So let's give this a spin. Let's listen to it. One thing that's important, you really must set this to metal. With the other types, you can record with different bias equalizations, which is what you'll achieve with each of these selections. But metal pushes a much higher current through the record head to erase that metal tape and to essentially lay down a nice clean demagnetized or erased, I should say, really, because that's what it's doing, erased tape before it records content or signal onto that tape. So now we're going to go ahead and play or record something and see how it sounds. Everything else is the same. I might have to change the input. We'll see. Okay, start it. I like to re-zero because there is about a counter length in there that is sometimes different. Bias to the left really doesn't buy you anything. Bias to the right, well, it could be. Now let's listen to that. It took us a while to get started. I'm about to change this. Notice? And as an extra added bonus so that I will get copyright dinged on YouTube. Now that is 1984 tape. This is, and this is probably one of the better tapes I have ever heard. This is much later and it is a Dolby SR tape. I don't know how they got such saturation on these tapes, but this is an SR tape released, I think, in the 90s sometime. These tapes, yeah, this is 1991. These tapes were phenomenal in the way that they were recorded in sound for pre-recorded tapes. The pre-recorded tapes should sound fine with this unit. Shouldn't be any issue with that. I don't have anything else to tell you about this deck. As I said, I'm going to take you on a tour around the back. And in fact, what I'm going to do is start by turning this around so that you can actually see the serial number. I like to do this so that people actually see the unit we were working with or playing and are understand that this is exactly the deck that you're getting. There's no sort of smoke and mirrors, if you will. That is a Z, let me see, I actually have it here, ZG9301214. I have two labels that I put on these. One is a QA checklist, tells you what I do when I test this before I let it go. I also have a service repair record that tells you what was done on the unit. As you could tell, this was starting to come off. These are removable. They're not permanent, but this tells you all of the work that was done to the unit. It also discloses anything that I had seen in this situation. The prior owner attempted to fix the mechanism, but wasn't able to do it. And of course I did all the work to it. So this is the unit. I'm now going to go off camera and take you on a tour just around it so you can see any of the blemishes that exist on the deck itself. First off, I always like to do the corners, because the corners are the first things that get damaged on these units. This one's in pretty good shape. I think I've got a minor scratch on the face. Let's see if we can zero in on it. Minor scratch there. Remember, this is brushed aluminum, can't do anything about that. Looks pretty good. This is brushed aluminum as well. You can't do much other than clean that. Notice everything is nicely polished. The buttons are nicely polished. Pretty good corner there. Pretty good corner there. No nicks on the top. Looks pretty good. Now, the case itself was a mess. I had to strip it and repaint it. The top was just not very good. Again, coming around this way, we see that blemish right about here. See a little nick here. I'm pretty sure might be a little bit of a blemish here on the knob. The rest looks good. Again, brushed aluminum. These corners look really good. Underneath looks pretty good. So you've got overall, you know, looks like a pretty, quite frankly, when I used to sell these in the in the early 80s, late 1970s, early 80s, this looks as good as any of those that I sold back then. I don't think I paid as much attention to them in terms of their how they looked. So that's it. I want to thank you for taking time to go through a very long video. I know these are long, and every now and again somebody doesn't like it, and I'm sorry about that, but I'd rather go through and show you all the things that I can about this so that you know exactly what it is that you're getting. Thanks. Take care.